In this module, we're going to take a look at the sociology of education. Most of us, obviously being in a class right now in sociology, have some experience with the educational system here in the United States, and we're going to dive into a lot of ways in which sociologists look at the educational system. So, first of all, functionalists really view the education system as serving a number of purposes. Remember, again, functionalists always want to look for, well, what is the purpose? What is it solving? And education is really first seen as one of the major functions of socialization, meaning education is really there to help socialize folks. So, as we discussed earlier in the course, school is one of the first and primary places that we start to socialize children, including also the family outside of that. In school, you learn things like how to be patient with one another, how to often cooperate, how to raise one's hand, wait one's turn. Those are all ways in which the school system is actually helping to socialize children to understand the norms and behaviors expected in much broader society. Functionalists also go on to explain further that there are deep impacts of core socialization and societal norms that happen in education. Those real understandings of what is right, what is wrong, often are actually taught in the elementary schools. So as you think about the schools, a lot of sociologists look at the idea that schools are responsible for cultural transmission. Functionalists believe that major portions of society's knowledge are passed from one generation to the next by this notion of cultural transmission. It's the idea that as generations tell stories, help to raise children, help to set new and different directions for society, all of that starts to get passed down in this process of cultural transmission, and that for society to really hold together, there has to be some degree of commonality to goals and values, certain traits of culture that are shared and passed down collectively. That's part of cultural transmission. From there, there's also really manifest or intended purposes of school and the educational system, and that's academic skills. Academic skills are really core. Schools are tasked with equipping children with these academic skills to function. And some of the major ones that schools don't necessarily get a ton of credit for, helping to teach people how to hold down jobs. A lot of the communication skills, collaboration skills, being able to effectively use written communication, all of those elements come from school, and that helps you to hold down jobs. Also, as you think about political candidates, and certainly not just presidential political candidates, but even for local and city state office, as you consider ballot initiatives and ballot measures or tax initiatives, we want to equip you through the school system to have a sense of critical thinking, to be able to really assess and evaluate different perspectives. Certainly there is a basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, and through the text you'll hear about different initiatives trying to bring back and then sometimes not bring back really the core foundational reading, writing, and arithmetic. But again, there's also a really big need to understand critical thinking and have an ability to analyze science as a functioning working adult in US society. Having a sense of knowing how to be critical about data that comes across your view, especially with the social media these days, is really an important life skill that school actually is there to help you through and set you out into a good foundation. Now, there are also latent, meaning unintended, consequences or other factors of education. So functionalists would also say, well, education provides childcare. Your children aren't with you, the parent, in most cases, unless you're homeschooling all day long. Instead, the school actually provides this childcare function so that many adults can go to work and be productive in the workforce. Now, postponing job hunting is brought up in your text, and it's an interesting proposition. This was true much more in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. But after the millennial generation kind of came into the workforce, which is most of you probably, a lot of folks are taking college courses and still getting a job. So back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, people would go to college and completely hold off getting a job, and so it was postponing that job hunting by going to college. Also, if you think about back in agricultural days, kids working on a farm would instead go to school, and so that school experience would keep them from working on the farm. So there's a lot of ways in which the job market is directly impacted by the way in which the educational system shows up in a society. Now, conflict theorists, they will look at tracking and hitting curriculum. They're more concerned again with that inequitable distribution. Who has access to school, who doesn't, what's the quality of teachers. But conflict theorists are also very interested in the notion of tracking, which is where often students are provided a label, either slow, average, maybe they're fast, and this really assigns reading groups, math groups. It might assign extracurricular activities or not. Some students have honors or GATE programs that they're welcomed into, and others are not. Well, that's all based on what conflict theorists would argue is just an arbitrary label. That often sometimes students could be intelligent in many other ways, creative ways or expressive ways, and that often standardized testing and things doesn't really accurately predict nor should be used for tracking. That's at least conflict theorists. Conflict theorists also say that there's really a hidden curriculum, that attitudes and values, whether right or wrong, are also taught through the school system, and those really help for everybody in adult life to fit in socially, politically, and kind of have an economic status. Now, hidden curriculum can sometimes be good, it could be bad, depending on your perspective. So an example of hidden curriculum might be that the school district in a very conservative town restricts books and says that there are certain books that cannot be seen in that particular library, they're not welcome on campus, or maybe they in fact decide what textbooks are used and only a certain list of textbooks can be used. In that scenario, they're limiting the knowledge. They're controlling some of the knowledge based solely on how they want the information presented. So that's hidden curriculum. Sometimes it's conscious. Most of the time it's not even conscious. It just reflects a lot of the values of the community. And that does bring up standardized testing as well. Conflict theorists will point out that often standardized tests, and this is a copy of my own SAT score from many, many years ago, and I've blurred it out for my own vulnerabilities, but as you can tell, this test was often used and still is today to determine how much success or not success people would have in college, and so it's used for often college admissions. Yet this one singular piece of paper can often not capture the full breadth and scope of you as a human, and so conflict theorists are very critical of it, citing that it doesn't really get at all of the dimensions of diversity within society. So there's other concerns also with education that your textbook will also go into much more depth on. Conflict theorists again are very interested in this unequal access notion. So what is taught, when is it taught, where, what do the supplies look like? Think about doing fundraising in a very, very poor, impoverished neighborhood. There's simply not money to be had, and so often raising funds is very, very challenging. Holding even bake sales can be difficult when there is no pocket money to be had from folks. Different than if you were living in a very suburban area, often a lot of parts of Valencia, in fact, where it's much more affluent. There's much larger houses, creating much larger property taxes, and people actually own their homes versus renting. There's also the notion of high school dropouts, and while this has been declining, it's always much more likely to be found in race and ethnic minorities and boys versus girls. And those who do drop out are often very disadvantaged in terms of their workforce participation and economic contribution into society. There's also violence within schools and bullying. More recently, we've moved away from talking about gun violence in schools, though it does occur and still is a major concern within America, but more so the gentle bullying through social media and then consistently kind of nitpicking, name calling, all of those issues that arise much more so now in high schools and also in junior high schools. And finally, the social media influence. We hear more and more stories on the news about those who might take their own life or take other adverse action based on teasing or bullying through social media. And also on the flip side, we've been able to also leverage social media to, in fact, have more online classes, be able to leverage the World Wide Web in a different way to bring education more broadly to folks, and to try and have much more open source. So there's a lot going on in the world of education, especially how sociologists look at it. I hope you've enjoyed this quick look, and I encourage you to continue to read through the rest of the chapter to ensure you pick up all the concepts.